So good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here today. It is this seminar that is focused on behavior change and self-regulation is really the result of lots of years of work and experience of this group, and so it's very good to be here. And it is also I'm very happy to be here because I'm a big fan of diversity. And this seminar is diverse in many aspects, both disciplinarily and internationally, but also, and it's not more difficult than having an international seminar, to have diversity in the teams that work in Portugal. And Pedro really could make it and put people from different universities here together, and also people in different stages of their careers. You have here from PhD students, postdocs, and of course, stars. And I will start by presenting Professor Robert West, which is a professor in health psychology. He's a director of the Tobacco Studies at Cancer Research UK Health Behaviour Research Centre, University College London. And he is an academic, an editor-in-chief at the journal Addiction. He has a career in academics, but he has also worked in collaboration with the English Department of Health, and he has also applied his knowledge in many programs that have impact in society. So it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce you, Professor Robert West.
It really is a great pleasure to be here. I absolutely love Lisbon, and I take every opportunity to come here. I have to say, I think I'm coming here 5 times this year. It's Lisbon, but Pedro was very generous and said at the beginning that although this may be like a game of football, there will be no losers. However, any of you who is aware of the English football team will be aware that we will lose on penalties to Germany. Okay, so this first presentation is going to be quite conceptual and theoretical, and it's work in progress. And so I hope that you will take it in the spirit in which it's offered, which is as a tentative way of approaching what is a very complex and broad topic, but a very interesting one, and one that I think in our field has been neglected in the past. But I know that from the work that's being done here, and certainly in my group, one that we hope to rectify. So what I want to do in these 15 minutes or so is just to set out a landscape for you, a map of where I think we can, how we can think about the issue of identity, particularly with a view to how we can help people to change their behavior using this particular construct. So I want to propose the framework to understand the various models and theories that exist within our area that involve the concept of identity. Some of these are specifically identity theories, but some of them are other theories, but they also involve identity as part of, in some ways, and sometimes in a small way, as part of what they do. And then to finish by discussing a couple of examples of how we may use these constructs in our work. The definition of identity that I'm going to use here is a very broad one. It's broader than many people use, but I think it has to be broad because that's where the boundaries naturally lie. So when I talk about identity, I'm talking about all of those mental representations that we hold of ourselves and the feelings that attach to those, the emotions and the desires that attach to those mental representations. So any time that you or I are thinking about ourselves or imagining ourselves, any time when we are part of our experience, that's when we're talking about identity. And in some of those cases, we'll be imagining things about ourselves that are very important to us, very profound and very deep and core to our being. But sometimes there'll be things about ourselves that we don't care about that much. So, for example, for a lot of men, being a good driver is an important part of their identity. A lot of men like to think that they're good drivers. Interestingly, about 80% of men think that they're above average drivers, which, if you know how statistics work, realize that this is not really very likely. But nevertheless, we feel this way. But we don't necessarily think that we're very good at doing the washing up. That is not necessarily part of our core identity. So it doesn't matter. These things may be core or they may not be core. Here are just some examples of theories that either focus on identity or include identity. There's Tajfel's famous social identity theory, which talks about how we develop an identity as a result of our social relationships with each other. There's Erikson's very famous theory about identity development, how as children we go from creatures that have no sense of ourselves quite rapidly to creatures that have a sense of ourselves, and what that involves in terms of development. We have self-perception theory, which is a theory about how we infer our attitudes from our behavior. We see ourselves doing things and we think, well, I must think that. So we see ourselves eating and we think, well, I must be hungry. The theory of planned behavior, favourite of so many British psychologists, has in it a very important element about self-perception. Perceived behavioral control. Social cognitive theory has self-confidence, self-efficacy. There's Roger's theory of self. There's self-determination theory, a very important newer theory, and so on and so forth. So these are all important theories, but what I want to do is to see if we can provide a framework, a structure, within which we can incorporate those theories so that we can see how those theories relate to each other and how some theories will focus on some parts of identity and others will focus on others. And the starting point for this is a very simple model in which we construe identity in terms of our self-thoughts, the things we think about ourselves, what we say about ourselves to ourselves, the propositions, the self-images. These are the iconic representations. If you're imagining yourself, what do I look like? What do I smell like? How do I feel? These are the iconic representations. And then the feelings that we have about things. Do I like myself? How do I feel? Am I a good? Do I feel happy about the kind of person I am? And of course, these things are very closely related to each other, because if you think about yourself in a particular way, that will lead you to feel about yourself in a particular way. But also, if you feel about yourself in a particular way, that will lead you to think about yourself in a particular way. And so, and I think, but I'm not sure, that these three elements and the interactions between them can form the core of any model that we want then to generate, to focus on. So let's look at self-thoughts. These are the things we say about ourselves to ourselves in our heads. And I would like to propose that we can identify three components of that which interact with each other. One of these is the labels we give to ourselves. What groups do we belong to? I'm a psychologist. I'm a father. I'm an amateur sportsman. I'm a guitar player. These are the categories that we assign to ourselves. We also have the attributes, the things that, if the categories are the nouns, the attributes are the adjectives. These are the things, the characteristics that we ascribe to ourselves. I'm ethical, I'm moral, I'm tall, I'm short, I'm thin, I'm fat. All of these things, these are the adjectives that we ascribe to ourselves. And then the third element, very, very important, and obviously is going to be a focus of a lot of today's work and discussion, are the personal rules. These are the things that we say, I do this and I don't do that. So I eat fish, I don't eat meat. I'm a vegetarian, I'm whatever. I don't drink before 6 o'clock in the evening, or before 4 o'clock in the morning. These are our rules. And these rules are, I believe, are absolutely fundamental to the structure of our behavior and the order and the continuity that we give to our behavior. But the rules can have very different characteristics, and then the way that we construct those rules, I believe, can make a big difference to how effective those rules are. I won't go into the details now. I'm going to talk more about that when I talk about prime theory. What about the self-images? So the self-images involve the self-perceptions, perceptions of ourselves. So perceptions are sensations information from our senses, but perception also involves meaning. It's the meaning that we give to these. So, for example, if you have a feeling in your tummy, in your stomach, that's just a feeling, that's a sensation. But if you interpret that sensation as hunger, that's perception. Okay? But these are made up of the self-sensations, the low-level feelings that we have. But we also, in our imagery, come at everything from a particular perspective. We can only ever, as human beings, see something from a given angle. We can't see all the way around it at one time. So we're looking at something from a particular perspective. And the perspective that we take on things has a very important role to play in the effect that our images have. And these interact with each other. And then finally, in our three-part concept of identity, of course, we have the feelings. What are feelings? These are hard to describe, but we know them when we feel them. On the one hand, we have our emotions. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you depressed? Are you surprised? Are you bored? But the ones that we're interested in here are targeted emotions, whether you like or dislike, particularly whether you like or dislike the things that make up your identity, the things that you are or that you want to, or that you could be. And those likes and dislikes relate to two very, very important drivers of behavior, and I'm going to talk more about this later in prime theory. Key drivers of behavior are wants and needs. From a very, very early age, children will tell you what they want and what they need, and that's important. They come to understand that, and they can communicate it. Wants, in this model, are about anticipated pleasure and satisfaction. They're positive. Needs are about avoiding discomfort. Under this model, this is just a way of describing these words. And these things relate to each other in complex ways. So that's the core component. But of course, we live in a world that isn't static. We live in a world that changes over time. And as part of our experience of ourselves, we have, it's very fortunate, I always think, that everything comes in threes. Have you noticed that? Which means that it's amazing, maybe it's an act of God or something, I don't know. Of course, it could just be that I can only think of three things. And maybe in the discussion we can see if you can come up with a fourth thing, or a fifth. So we have the time component. We have our current self, as we are. We have our past self, as we were. And we have, very importantly, our future self, as we might be. And if you think about, remember that we're talking about images, and we're talking about thoughts, and we're talking about the feelings attached to those, you can immediately start, I hope, to see how the idea of the future self can be potentially an important generator of wants and needs, of feelings about things that you can achieve. So with that model, you can then start to delineate some important measurable dimensions of identity, which you can create questionnaires, or you can observe behavior and make records and see where people are on these dimensions, and how these dimensions may then be important in generating behavior. So, first of all, let's just look at the the big dimension of self-consciousness, and Pedro and I had a very interesting talk over dinner a couple of nights ago about the issue of self-consciousness. I talk about identity quite a lot in lectures, and one of the things I do is to say to people who are in the lecture theatre, such as yourselves, until this moment, probably you weren't self-conscious. You were thinking, well, you were either sleeping or writing notes or doing your emails, or you were just focusing on me as your focus of attention. But now that I've mentioned it, I can see that you're all self-conscious, because now the focus is on you as the audience. And it's a very interesting trick that comedians do in order to generate tension in an audience, is to pick on members of the audience, and now all of the audience is focusing on themselves, and heightened tension, as we know, is an important and useful thing in creating humor. So self-consciousness is a very important dimension, and an interesting empirical question is, to what extent are there stable attributes of people in terms of how self-conscious we tend to be? I think there are. I know that I am quite self-conscious as a person. I spend a lot of time thinking about myself. I know that my brother is off the scale on self-consciousness. I think he's self-conscious when he's asleep. Other people, and you probably know where you are on this scale, hardly ever. You're always outward-looking, focused. So, and where does that come from? And what does it mean? What does that self-consciousness mean in terms of how you're then going to react to interventions that might be involved in changing your behavior? And self-awareness is not necessarily the same thing. So self-consciousness will be how you think and how you feel about how you may be being observed or observing yourself, whereas self-awareness is merely the experience of yourself in your thoughts. So these are just two possible measurable entities. Clearly, for behavior change, two others that are very important that we focus on a lot are self-regulation and self-control. And many people don't distinguish between the two, but I think it's useful to be able to distinguish them, and with self-control being primarily about, given your impulse or your desire to do something different, to what extent are you able to impose your self-rules, make your self-rules control your behavior. So it's a momentary thing, and it's kind of like it's this act of will. Self-regulation is much broader. Self-regulation is all of those things that you can do, your skills, your knowledge, your understanding of yourself, so that you can exercise self-control when the time comes. Very important in terms of emotion, self-esteem and self-liking. So they're not necessarily the same things. With self-esteem, this is how much worth we place on ourselves. Self-liking is how much we like ourselves. When we see ourselves, when we have a view of ourselves when we're thinking about ourselves, do we like what we see or do we hate it? Working in my field, the field of drug addiction, we know that very large proportion of people who get into difficulties with heroin or stimulants or other illicit drugs, they have not only low self-esteem, but they really do not like themselves. And there are various reasons for that. If you look in people's upbringings, for example, you see a very high proportion of people who've suffered abuse as children, either sexual abuse or physical abuse, and they've had very fractured and inconsistent parenting. So issues of self-esteem and self-liking are going to be very important. You could have very high self-esteem, but not like yourself. You could be someone you think, I'm pretty good, but not very nice. I don't like it. What about ones that are actually quite close to home in terms of self-determination theory, for example? There is how much we have a sense of being in control of our destiny, and you're going to hear much more about that, so I won't dwell on it. But there's also, I think, a very interesting one where I think there are probably big cultural differences, the issue of collectivity, which is when we think of ourselves, do we think of ourselves as individuals, as people, or as part of a group? Is it I or is it we? So, for example, we know that in some cultures, family is the group. Family is the thing that people think about. And that can lead people to behave in ways that seem strange to those of us who live in very individualistic societies. So, for example, I did a jury service some years ago in which it was a case in which there was a kidnapping. And I was sitting on the jury, and essentially the reason for the kidnapping was because the person who was kidnapped, a member of his family, a cousin, owed this person money. And so the person was kidnapped so that this person would get their money back. And this was kind of accepted. I mean, frankly, if my cousin owed money and they kidnap me, that's not going to do any good. Not in my family. So, but clearly in some cultures it does. Self-coherence. To what extent do all the bits of our identity fit together? And self-conflict, if they do or do not fit together, how do they map up with each other? So, for example, creating cognitive dissonance is a very important tool for behavior change. When you're saying, well, you say that you want to be a good mother. You think you're a good mother, but how can you be a good mother if you do this? So creating this conflict and raising the salience of it. Self-confidence and self-evaluation, not necessarily the same thing. Self-confidence, we're all very familiar with. It's a very common part of many theories that we use. To what extent do we judge ourselves to have high levels of skill and knowledge? And self-evaluation is not necessarily the same thing. In self-evaluation, it's how much do we think we might be wrong? I used to teach medical students quite a lot, and I have to say that there were some medical students who I used to teach. I would not want those medical students treating me because they were never wrong. In their eyes, they thought, well, they had no self-reflection. We all, especially as scientists, but also as clinicians, need to be reflective. So, to finish up then, how does all this relate to identity change? Well, I think there are two key areas where what I've been talking about relates to our interest in behavior change. One is that identity is a hugely important source of motivation, both to change, but also not to change. The second thing is that identity is the fundamental basis for self-control. The clue is in the name. It has the word self in it. And if you have a fractured identity, or if your identity is very weak, or if you hate yourself, or whatever it might be, you're in a very bad shape for exerting self-control, and you're going to be very much at the whim, at the mercy of the forces that are driving your behavior in the immediate situation. So here are just three very simple examples. There's millions of examples in the literature if you look at them. These are just ones that I identified. A concept of identity that was found in one interesting study on athletic identity, appearance, competence, importance of exercise and encouragement, correlated pretty well with exercise frequency. Okay, so there's a thought. Here, does one use, and how powerful can it be generating an athletic identity to get some people to do more exercise? We've done work in my group looking at the non-smoker identity. When people stop smoking, very soon after they've stopped, some people, they're now a non-smoker. In their eyes, they're a non-smoker. And other people, they're not smoking, but they still think of themselves as a smoker. And when you follow them up, not surprisingly, you find that the people who have the non-smoker identity are more likely to maintain abstinence. And then, of course, we have the work that's being done on self-affirmation interventions, where if you can create positive self-esteem generally, it makes people more receptive to persuasive communications that challenge their current behavior. And then finally, of course, we have self-determination theory, which focuses on three key elements of identity: competence, the autonomy, and relationships, which I would label, we've covered autonomy, connectedness is one way of looking at relationships, and competence is obviously related to self-confidence. So to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that identity is an important driver of behavior. There are many, many aspects, and I've only touched the surface of it. But I think what we may have here is the beginnings of a structure in which we can see how the different models of identity and theories can be fitted together. Theories such as self-determination theory focus on core aspects of identity that we believe are very important in driving behavior. And the question then is, how can we harness this more effectively to help people and support people to change the behaviors in ways that they want, to generate the personal rules that they need to generate in a way that are going to be effective, and then stick to those rules. Thank you.